few months ago, Pastor Ken began talking to me about, I'm going to be gone on April 7th. You're going to have to preach. As we get closer, we'll figure out at what part of Ephesians we will be in, but it looks like it's going to be right around marriage and the family, which immediately for me is like, this is awesome because I'm the youth pastor and I love to speak on marriage and the family. As we talked last week, strong families and parents and for kids. And I was like, if it's Ephesians chapter 6 to get to preach from the big stage and yell at these kids down here would be even more exciting. And so today we're going to talk about slavery. Pastor Ken, he told me, he was like, oh yeah, you're going to throw me under the bus, aren't you? And I'm like, well, it's not your fault. It's just kind of fallen into this. And I'm like, the easy thing would have been, let's talk about families and parenting and kids. And slavery is not very easy. Now, I don't know, I do know. Don't call it out. But when you think of the word slavery, I am going to venture to say that the images that are in your mind have to do with maybe the 19th and 20th century America. Our image of slavery is not a pretty picture, not that there is a pretty picture of slavery, but through our American lens, we think of slavery, we go to the 17 and 1800s of America. A race-based slavery in which we had slave traders who would go into Africa and they would rip people out of their homeland, kidnap them, put them in subhuman conditions, bring them across the ocean and sell them as property. They had no rights. They were beaten. They were killed. It was a terrible travesty in American history. We have to own up to that fact of our history. It's a dark time. Maybe think of the positives of Abraham Lincoln and the fight against slavery. Maybe you think of the Civil War and the division of our country during this time. For me, I'm a history geek. Some of you have shared that with me. Matt Fox probably knows exactly where I'm about to go. Ulysses S. Grant. I picked up, after we got back from vacation last year, I picked up a biography of Ulysses S. Grant. We had been in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia, and I'm like, I need a good biography to read after seeing all this American history. And the only thing the library had was one on Ulysses S. Grant, and it was 971 pages long. And it obviously took a while, but I read the whole thing, and I kid you not, at the end of his life, and then he passed away, I was sitting on the couch turning my head from Lindsay, wiping tears away, because I'm like, he's gone! It's like, spoiler alert in case you didn't know. And I think of Ulysses S. Grant and his fight against slavery. And so today, as we look at Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 9, we're going to be talking about slavery. But Paul is speaking, obviously, about a different type of slavery than what we're looking at in American history. It doesn't make it right whatsoever, and understand that context. So we'll look at the context in just a minute. But if you'll look in Ephesians chapter 6, we'll begin reading in verse 5. Paul writes, "Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or free. Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him." Parents and families would have been a lot easier to deal with than this passage. But I got to tell you, as I was studying through this week, God has just really stirred some fun things in my heart. I have loved getting to look at this. You see, the first thing that we look at with slavery is the fact that we oftentimes will read this and go, well, I'm not a slave, and I don't own slaves, so I just need to understand the context, and I don't have a whole lot that I have to do with this passage in my life. And I want to begin by saying that is simply not true, because Paul is speaking into a culture and a context, and he's saying more than just slaves obey your masters, masters treat them with respect. What he is saying is so radical that when we understand the context and the things that he's really saying, it should absolutely help us to understand how transformed our lives should be lived. And so this morning, I guess the first thing that we really have to talk about, of course, is the big elephant in the room of what do we as Christians do with the topic of slavery? If you get on Google and you search the Bible and slavery, you will find a wide array of search results. You will find some that are apologetic in nature, talking about kind of what I'm about to do of just what is the cultural context and the picture of slavery in the Bible. Is it the same as the 18th and 19th century? What do we as Christians do with that? And when we understand that, it doesn't make it any less right, but the Bible doesn't condone it. On the opposite side of that, you find some very nasty posts that say, well, in the Bible it mentions slavery, and of course they do this and this and this, and you know, they would take prisoners of war, and so the Bible is a nasty, vile book because it talks about slavery and they never condemn it. As we begin looking at this, obviously we have to understand what's going on. The first thing is sometimes people look at this and say, well, it doesn't say slaves, it says bondservants, or maybe your translation says servants. The Greek word is doulos, which means slave. So I'll at least go ahead and get there. Paul is writing to slaves. It's not this picture of like, oh, they're just an employee who happens to live there and whatnot. He is writing into a culture that is full of slavery. Full of slavery. And so, again, it's not the same context that we're looking at in American history. It's not this race-based slavery that Paul is writing into. But he's writing into a culture in which slavery is so widespread that it is something that just is cranking the economy. There are so many slaves at this time that it is ingrained into the economy of the early Greco-Roman culture. And now we don't excuse it because it's a different form of slavery, because the Bible is very clear about its picture of slavery. In the book of Exodus, chapter 21, it says, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. Now, I don't know about you, but it seems pretty clear to me that it's not smiled upon. There is a harsh punishment for someone who will kidnap someone, rip them from their homeland, bring them somewhere else, and sell them. And so, very clearly, what we look at in American history was sin, and it was wrong, and I think that we would all agree with this. And the fact that there were people then who would take the Bible and twist it in order to use it to their gain is shameful. Because the Bible is very clear that this is unacceptable. And some people go, well, that's the Old Testament. Well, Paul in his letter to Timothy, in 1 Timothy, and Timothy was one of the pastors at Ephesus at some point, and so understanding that context is important. He lists out all of these sins in chapter 1, verse 10. And he speaks on sexual sin and the way that we should act and all of these different things, but he calls out slave traders. And so even Paul in other parts of the Bible is calling out the practice of trading slaves. Now people often ask like, well, why did Paul just simply not condemn this practice of slavery that is going on? And so as we look at this context, we have to understand, what do we do with slavery? It's a tough topic because it's not accepted, but Paul never explicitly says, stop it. At this time in the Greco-Roman culture, many scholars estimate that as many as 1/3 of the population were actually slaves. To the number of 60 million people were in slavery in the area, okay? And it was wrong. There were government reforms that were happening to begin to improve the life. I mean, they were looking for a better life for them. Now, it was different because when we think of slavery, the slaves couldn't really earn their freedom. They could escape. Here in America, they could escape and go to another state and, all that different stuff. There was the Underground Railroad. But in this culture, many of the slaves were able to earn or purchase their freedom by the time they were 30 years old. Again, not saying it's right, it's just helping us to understand it's a different look at slavery than what we're so used to in American culture. And so how would someone become a slave? It wasn't, just complete kidnapping, but many of the slaves would become slaves through birth. So if their parents were slaves and then they gave birth, that child would automatically become property of the master. Some of the kids would find themselves in slavery just by abandonment from their parents. A very ugly picture because the parents couldn't afford to take care of them. And they would just throw them out on the street and they would be picked up. What a horrible, horrible thing to just take advantage of kids. Some of them were captives in war. And so they were taken as prisoners of war and then they were forced into slavery. The last two were a little bit different. A lot of them had inability to pay their debts, and so they would go into servitude in order to pay back their debts, but they were considered a slave. They really didn't have rights at that point. And so they were forced into slavery because they were too poor to pay their debts, so they'd have to spend time with a wealthy master to begin working off their debts. And then the one that completely blows my mind is some people would say, well, I could probably get a better life by selling myself into slavery because this guy is so wealthy, all of my needs would be met, and so I will just be his slave. And so you see that it's a very diverse look at what slavery is in the first century, and understanding it's very widespread. Paul was also writing into a culture that was not Christian. And so if Paul were to go, guys, why are you having slaves? It's kind of like when we expect people who are not Christ followers to live by the Bible. It's absurd. Why would they live by the Bible if they don't believe that it's true? We shouldn't hold them to the standard. We want to get them to where they believe that it's the truth. But why would someone who's not a Christ follower live as though Christ is their Lord? It doesn't make sense. And so Paul is writing into a culture where they don't believe that this is the truth. As well as if slaves were released, they would possibly forfeit their citizenship. They would lose many of their rights, but if they stayed as a slave and could eventually earn their freedom, life would be better. They could possibly even face death if a master were to release a slave. And so it was a very complex situation. And so as we understand this culture that, and this context that we're speaking into, it's important for us to understand that it's not the same as what we typically look at with slavery, but all slavery is wrong. And even in today's world, in case you're not aware, slavery is still a real issue. And there's a lot of great organizations that are fighting against slavery to end slavery. Approximately 40 million people are still in slavery. There's sex slavery. I mean, it's an abomination to God. And I believe that as Christ followers, we say people need the Lord, as Melissa just sang. They need the Lord too. And to sit back on our hands and just go, well, what can I really do? Get creative. That's my challenge on that this morning. There's a lot of organizations that are doing great work, and awareness, in my opinion, is simply not enough to begin taking those next steps to fight for justice. So what do we do about this issue of slavery? How do we pull this out? Understanding the context, you're not a slave and you don't own slaves. So what do we do with the passage at this point to go, okay, this is really easy to apply? Understanding the context and the culture, I believe that Paul gives us three really great challenges through what he's really saying, because he's saying some radical things. The first thing that Paul is saying, he says, Jesus will change your relationships. Jesus will change your relationships. Do you notice in this stretch of passages over the past few weeks what we've done? We have looked at wives submit to your husbands, children submit to your parents, and now slaves submit to your masters. And so as you're looking at that, I think what we hear a lot of times is submit. But I want to kind of flip that on its head where who are the three people that Paul is addressing? He is addressing women, he is addressing children, and now he is addressing slaves. And in the first century, those people were voiceless. It was a male-led society, and now Paul is speaking into a Christian culture and saying at the foot of the cross, everyone is on level ground. The culture would not speak into women and children and slaves, but someone who is a Christ follower, it transforms the way that we relate to one another. And it demands that no matter what culture says, that if culture says it's acceptable to treat someone in this form or this fashion, if you're a Christ follower, you have to obey Jesus, not what culture says. And so Paul is speaking into this slave-filled culture. And while people would say, well, you're a slave and I'm a master, and even though I identify with Jesus, Paul goes, I don't care what culture says, because Jesus says this. And he begins to speak into how they should relate to one another. And he doesn't just address slaves. He says, work with a sincere heart, be obedient, respect your master. But I love what he says down at the end in verse 9. Paul tells the masters what? He says, do the same to them. You see, in our culture's no different. We have people who are down low on the totem pole. We have people who are up high, and we respect, rightfully so, the people who have earned the position. People who are in certain positions deserve to be respected. But what sometimes we forget is that at the foot of the cross, everyone is on level ground. Jesus doesn't show any partiality. Jesus doesn't care if you're a CEO or if you're a grocery bagger. That doesn't earn you any more love from God because you have climbed the corporate ladder. And I don't think anyone in here would think so. But do we always live that out? See, Paul is speaking, he says, your slaves or your masters, that relationship can be redeemed by Jesus. And that relationship couldn't even look different, because the slaves and the masters, the way that they related to one another, and as we're going to go on here in just a second, the slaves could slack off. They could not work. They could not be honest. The masters could treat them harshly because this is my property. And Paul says, no, you're throwing all of that out, that if you're a Christ follower, your first master is King Jesus. And what he says is to love one another. And in fact, as you look in Matthew chapter 22, Jesus says this. He says, you should love your neighbor as yourself. In fact, if you were in life group this morning and you go through D6 curriculum, you probably looked at that passage. And he says that in the context of the Good Samaritan, as one of the teachers says, yeah, you should love your neighbor as yourself, but who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells this radical story of your neighbor is the person that you probably hate more than anybody. Like, that's essentially what it is. Your neighbor is the Samaritan who's a half-breed that you're racist against, and you're supposed to love them. It was a radical teaching by Jesus that sometimes I think we step back and we're like, I need to love everybody. And Jesus is like, no, not everybody. Everybody, not like excluding this person over here because they wronged you when you were in the second grade. Don't pretend like we don't hold grudges. Some of us are still holding on to stuff that we can never let go of. And Jesus says, no, you love all people, whether you're a slave working in the worst conditions in the world or you're a master who is at the top. That relationship is a reflection of Jesus. And Jesus also says in John 13 to his followers, he says, by this, people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. We are known for our love. And if we are not loving, what does that say about our relationship with Jesus? It's just kind of a logical flow. People will recognize if you're a Christ follower by the way that you relate to others. I found this quote as I was studying through about relations. It says, no relation is merely a relation. It is a context for relating to Christ. See, I think oftentimes we look at our relationships here on earth and we think, well, that's just a friend or whatnot. But the Bible paints this picture that the way that we treat all people is a reflection of our relationship with Jesus. And no matter what culture says about a people group or a person, or if this person has wronged you or somewhere in your past, someone hurt you and deeply, and you would be rightfully justified to never forgive them in the eyes of the world. Jesus says, no. That's simply not true. You were my enemy, and yet I went to the cross for you. And so when Paul is speaking into a culture of slavery and masters, he is saying something so radical that if you're a slave or you're a master, that relationship is a picture of my relationship with you. Because we are slaves to sin, and he is our master in heaven, and yet that relationship is made right. And so this morning, I think some of us need to be reminded that Jesus transforms our relationships. The second thing is Jesus will transform your actions. And this is where Paul goes into how do we practically apply to this to our lives. He says slaves are to obey their masters. And look at verse 5. He says, with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or free. So Paul immediately goes, I don't care if you're a slave or you are a free person, the way that you live and you work is a reflection of Jesus Christ. Now, I don't know about you, but I have not always treated my jobs as such. I've not always looked at life of like, this is an opportunity to serve Jesus as I scrub this toilet. Because we sit there and think, well, that's extreme. But when you read the Bible, it doesn't seem so extreme, does it? Because Paul's just like, no, this is the way that it is. Paul says, live your life to do the will of God from your heart. Work sincerely. You don't change your actions in order to receive approval from people. You do the right action the first time simply because it's right and pleasing to God. You don't just work when your master is looking. Slaves in this context were well known to be liars and lazy. And who can blame them? I mean, they were slaves. No one wants to find themselves in servitude, to be in forced labor. And so if the master's not looking, why would I ever want to do something to please him if he's an angry person? Like, there's not a relationship there. But Paul says, no, see, I don't care what context you're in. If you're a Christ follower, work with a sincere heart. Don't wait until they're looking at you to then suddenly start doing a better job. Work hard because as you're going through, it's a reflection of Jesus Christ. And so this is the easy part of the message, to simply apply it to our lives and be like, well, easily, the workplace, employer and employee relations. But what I have found as I've looked at this and I've listened to messages and I've studied is we get that, but we fail to apply that. Now, I'm not saying like we're perfect people, but it's one of those I've worked with Christians in other jobs before, and some of them are horrible employees. It's like you are so unreliable, and you're a reflection of Christ is what Paul says. Do you ever clock in and you waste time because nobody's looking? That's stealing time. Like the practicality of what Paul is saying can easily be applied to our everyday jobs, whether you like it or you don't. And as Paul goes on, don't forget, there's always and masters do the same to them. And so if you notice the title of today's message, because I told Mike, I said, the problem with this is it's easy for us to walk out and be like, well, that wasn't for me. But the title today is We're All Slaves and Masters. Because if you have a job, there is some form of slavery going on. It's a much better slavery than you ever look at. Some of you are amening because you don't like your job. Others of you understand what we're getting at is that there is an agreement going on between you and an employer that you have to meet certain expectations in order to receive certain benefits. But we're all masters too. Approximately 41% of the church is going to be at Culver's this afternoon. Hard numbers, I've run the science on it. The other half will go get Mexican food somewhere. And the remaining 10% are on a budget. But when you go out to eat, no, they don't call you master, but you have someone who is serving you that day. And I know without a shadow of a doubt, every Christian is always kind and gentle and does not judge someone by the day that they're having as a service, right? We're masters in that moment. And Paul says that it is an opportunity to relate to them as though they are Jesus Christ. And I am guilty. What changed my life was whenever I got a job in the service industry. I was a valet at a hotel, and there were some nasty and vile people in the world. And there's just nasty people, period. And it shows in the side of their car. And whenever I began to work in the service industry, I began to have compassion on people who were in that. And I heard the story of someone who went out to eat and they had terrible service from a young server. Now, I don't like it, and I'm not excusing laziness. But at the end, when the check came, like everyone had this awkward moment where this mom and dad were paying for the food. And they were expecting them to kind of be like, well, I ain't tipping her. Just, this has been pathetic. She hasn't refilled my drink, blah, blah, blah. But instead, this mom and dad said, we realize you've been running hard, and it's been really hard to get our order correct. And we want you to know we're not upset. And so here's your tip. And can we pray for you in any way? I think that's what Jesus would want us to do. And I look on my life and go, I don't know if I've always been the gracious master that I should have been in that context. And it's an opportunity in our actions, the way that we act, not just relating to people, but the way that we act, the way that we live out our faith in the workplace, the way that we go to school. I challenge our students all the time, do your best in academics, because that's not popular to say. And it's not because you need to get the scholarship, but it's because you're doing your homework for King Jesus. That's what the Bible teaches us in everything that we do. And that leads us into our last point. Jesus will change your purpose. So you may not be able to transfer your earthly master, but you can transfer your heavenly master. And whether you have a great boss or a terrible boss, you're not really working for that boss anyways. Paul says down in verse 7, he says to the slave to render service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. Paul says elsewhere, whatever you do, do all for the glory of God. And what's crazy is if you do a word study in the Greek, the word whatever there, it means whatever. It's like you can try to find a way around it, but it's almost like God knew what he was doing when he used certain words. He said, whatever you do is an opportunity to serve Jesus himself. My first job was at a small grocery store in my tiny town. I was responsible to stock aisle 2B, which had rice-a-roni and pasta and canned goods and a few other things. And I wish I could tell you that every day that I went in on Tuesdays and Thursdays and we received the shipment, that as I put a can of green beans, that worship music was coming out of my mouth. But I didn't view my job as though, oh, Jesus, bless this can of cut green beans from Del Monte. It was never my prayer. And as I read this week, it kind of shook my world because I realized Jesus cares about the mundane parts of our life. Because we think, well, God doesn't care how I mow my grass. I have never in my life before this week thought that maybe God cared about what I did at home to keep my house clean. But when he says, when you serve as though you are serving Jesus himself. And if I look at everything that I do through that lens, you better believe it's going to radically change the way that I look at life. I love this quote that I found from commentator John Stott. He says, it is possible for the housewife to cook a meal as if Jesus Christ were going to eat it, or to spring clean the house as if Jesus Christ were the honored guest. It is possible for teachers to educate children, for doctors to treat patients, for nurses to care for them, for shop assistants to serve customers, accountants to audit books, and secretaries to type letters, as if in each case they were serving Christ. But we don't do that. Let's just be honest. But Paul says this is an opportunity. Slave, you were in a terrible situation, but guess what? It's an opportunity to serve Jesus, so you should serve joyfully. You see, Paul is really talking about a paradigm shift in the way that we look at the world through this passage. And we're able to look at the context of slaves and masters, but for us who do not live in that culture and that context, it takes a little bit more to realize how radical what he is saying to apply it to our lives. And so today, as we close, I just want to give 3 questions that we can apply. First is, who is it that I struggle in loving like Christ? Who is that person that you struggle to just love? I love what Dr. Neil Gilliland, he's been here a number of times. He was just at Collide with us with our students. He says, think of the person that you love the least. We don't hate anybody as Christians. We just love some people a whole lot less, right? And so the Christian way, who is it that you love the least? And maybe it is someone who wronged you, and you need to offer forgiveness. Maybe it's someone who just, they grate on your ever-loving nerves because they are just that person. Some people are just that way, and it's okay to admit that. But it doesn't mean that we don't love them. Maybe it's your parents. Maybe it's your children. But see, if every relationship is an opportunity to relate to Jesus himself, you better believe we better be transformed in the way that we have relationships. If a slave and a master can be redeemed to have a proper relationship between Jesus, what's our excuse? What's our excuse? The second question, am I being Christ-like in the way that I'm a slave or a master? As you read through this stuff, serve with a sincere heart. Serve Jesus himself. Don't just do it in way of eye service. Don't just serve to please people. Do you apply that in your job? Do you apply that in your academics? The Bible demands us to make a choice. Will I obey the Bible or will I do what I want to? I don't care what is acceptable in culture. The Bible, it transcends culture. What God says goes further than what culture says is acceptable to us. Whether that's relationally, whether that's how I practice my work ethic, whether that's how I treat that poor server who struggled so bad today and brought everyone the wrong meal. There's bigger things to lose sleep over. And in fact, I believe in those moments, God's going, I'm going to test you out today. How are you going to serve me in this moment? Because culture will tell you to get a free meal out of it. But I say love them. And the last question, which is the most important, who is your master? Who are you serving? Because even the master in this passage was serving someone if he's a follower of Jesus. And if he's serving Jesus, then he was told, do the same to your slave that I commanded the slave to give to you. Honor and respect, obedience. You're serving Christ whenever you serve your slave, is what he tells the master. See, there's those who are beneath us in our life sometime that we think we have an excuse to step over. You don't have to be the CEO of a company to be a master. And it doesn't just have to go out to eat. Sometimes it's just people that we relate to. But if we have truly been transformed by Jesus Christ, then it changes the way that we relate to other people. If we came to the realization that Jesus Christ is our master, then there's nothing in life that is not under his lordship. Everything falls under the umbrella of Jesus Christ as Lord. Everything. We can't just box off our life and be like, all right, Jesus, you got this part over here. I'll be over here, though. And how often do we try to do that? And in that culture, masters could do anything. Masters could do anything. They could get away with anything. If they killed their slave, oh well, it was your property. And Paul says, no. That's not the way it's going to be amongst followers of Jesus. Because your master is in heaven. I love this quote as we close from Abraham Kuyper, famous theologian. And I think it speaks really well into this. And this is what Jesus is saying about my life. He's saying it about your life too. Kuyper said, there is not a square inch. There's not a square inch. And so as I was thinking through this, I'm like, how big is a square inch? We're looking a square inch. There's not a square inch in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. There's not a square inch in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. And some of us step back and go, I don't know if I like that or not. But let me tell you, when he claims your life, there is no greater master than King Jesus. He's a good and kind master. He is a loving master who will transform your life. And if there is a part of your life that is outside, whether you are a Christ follower or you're just listening to me going, I don't really know what that means, but I like the sound of following Jesus this morning. In a moment, we're going to have an invitation. You can come forward or you can meet me after church. We would love to have that conversation and just tell you a little bit more about what that looks like. because it's the best choice that you will ever make in your life. But it's really easy for us as Christians to go, well, I got saved when I was 8. Jesus says Kuyper says there's not a square inch in which Jesus does not say, this is mine. Is every square inch of your life under the lordship and mastership of King Jesus? Because he claims it, but he'll let you hold on to it. He will not force you to give your life up to him. He will not force you to give this square inch. You may give him 99.9% of your life and keep 1 square inch. And he's going, that's mine. And why I got emotional is because as Melissa was singing, People Need the Lord, at Truth of Peace every summer, Dr. Neil Gilliland does this little skit. There's no words. And it's the story of this little boy who has a teddy bear. And as he's acting this out, behind him, the music that is playing is People Need the Lord. And in that skit, Neil, if you know Neil, Neil's just so fun and goofy. And he puts on this little hat and he acts like a little kid, and he has this teddy bear, and he's acting between him and the Father. And he's acting out, and he's going, oh, you want this? No. But eventually he turns it over to the Father, and then he gives him his heart, but he rips just a little part of his heart and gives it, and he keeps the rest. And at the end, what happens is once he gives God his whole heart, he pulls out a brand new heart that is white, it is unstained. And then he gets the chance to go and start handing it out. And so as she was singing, I'm sitting over there boo-hooing because I'm thinking, this is it. If my master is King Jesus, this is what it's all about. Paul says if you submit to God, you will submit to others, and it transforms every part of your earthly life. And this morning he is saying, your life is mine. Can I please have it? So whether it's your relationships, your work ethic, or maybe it's just transferring who your master is. We're going to have a time of invitation. The altars are open. And if this is just, you're going, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do when I get up there, we can come pray with you. Or you can just talk to us after church. I've always said there's nothing special about these padded pieces of wood. Because if our heart's not in it, there's really nothing special. It's only a padded piece of wood. When it becomes special is when we come with our whole heart and say, King Jesus, this is yours.